Okay, it's all yours.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for having me today. As Gary said, I'm Lisa Muras. I'm a registered dietitian and certified diabetes care and education specialist. That's a mouthful at VHC Health, formerly known as Virginia Hospital Center. I have been in diabetes management for quite a while. Most of my experience is in outpatient, which means we see patients with diabetes, prediabetes, as well as other conditions that are impacted by nutrition in our clinic here on the hospital campus. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about healthy eating, which of course is a very broad topic. I'm going to try to provide some education about different nutrients in our diet, some of the purposes of those in the body, talking about good, healthy sources of different nutrients, and then just some things we want to be kind of thinking about as we build our plate. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and bring up some slides to kind of walk us through. All right. So these are the topics we're going to cover today. We're going to start talking about the macronutrients. Those are your carbohydrates, protein, and fat. We're going to talk about eating for a strong heart, some things we can do in terms of diet to make sure we're providing good nutrition for one of the most important organs in our body, which is, of course, our heart. Building a healthy plate, and that's going to go into just things we want to think about as we decide what we're having for breakfast, for lunch, snacks, those types of items. We'll talk a little bit about label reading. You may have noticed a few years ago that the nutrition facts label had some changes, had some new things brought upon it. So we'll talk about what to look for there. And then we'll wrap up talking about sodium and fiber. So hopefully we'll have some time for questions. And if you think of anything, please put that in the chat box and I'll be happy to try to address that. So starting out at a very broad level, what is our food made up of? When we're kind of thinking about, something like an apple, what does that come parts of? How does that come all together to help benefit our body? With our food, we have macronutrients, which is where we get our calories. That will include carbohydrates, protein, and fat. It's going to provide energy to our body. We also have micronutrients. Those are things that we need in smaller amounts. Still very important, still something we want to have as part of a healthy diet, but we don't need them in terms of energy as we do with the macronutrients. So those are our vitamins and minerals. That includes all the water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins, as well as many important minerals like potassium and calcium and magnesium. So something that we need just as much as those macronutrients in our diet. A common question I get from patients is, well, how many carbohydrates should I be eating a day? How do I know if I'm getting enough protein? Am I eating too much fat? There is no set recommendation for the entire population. There's no amount we can go to and say, okay, well, everybody should be eating X grams of carbohydrates per day. The reason for that is it is based on various factors that can change from person to person. So it's based on your age, your weight, your height, your activity level, whether you're male or female, what life stage of life you're in, meaning are you a pregnant adult or are you an older adult? So it's going to really vary from person to person. The dietary guidelines for Americans, which is sort of like our blueprint for what we want to eat, it recommends about 45 to 65% of your total calories per day coming from carbohydrates. So that's going to comprise the major amount of your macronutrients. Protein somewhere between 10 and 30% of total daily calories, and then fat somewhere between 25 and 35%. If you haven't heard of the dietary guidelines for Americans, it's really an important document. It comes together every 5 years. So our last one was 2020 through 2025. So we're now in the progress of gearing up for the next iteration of that. But basically it brings together experts, epidemiologists, dietitians, physicians, and looks at all of the nutrition research for the previous 5 years and decides if they want to make some changes to the current recommendations. If you recall, a few years ago with the 2020 dietary guidelines, the recommendation for cholesterol was dropped, and that's where it kind of came back that, oh, we can eat eggs now. It was based on the research that our dietary cholesterol, so the cholesterol we're getting from things like eggs, did not impact blood cholesterol as much as previously thought. So that was a change that you may have personally noticed out in the news and in different types of outlets in terms of cholesterol, and that came from the dietary guidelines. So that's just a little bit about what that document is. Starting with the first macronutrients are carbohydrates. Those are the starches, sugars, and fibers that we find in our food. So you can kind of think about carbohydrates as a bit of an umbrella. And underneath that umbrella, we've got sugars, we've got starches, and we've got fiber. All of those comprise carbohydrates. Starch is basically just a chain of sugar molecules. And so all starch is eventually broken down into sugar and then converted into glucose in the body. So sometimes that's a little surprising to some of my patients with diabetes. You know, they think, oh, well, diabetes, of course, I need to think about sugar. And they're looking at that label for, you know, total amount of sugar for different types of foods. And we really want to provide education that, well, it's not just sugar, it's also starch, because starch is going to break down into sugar and will still have an impact on your blood sugar. Carbohydrates generally, depending on the type of carbohydrate, are digested much faster than protein or fats. So they're digested and absorbed by the body within about 2 hours of eating. We'll talk about two different types of carbohydrates, simple and complex. And simple carbohydrates can be broken down much faster, whereas a complex carbohydrate is going to take a little bit longer. But as compared to protein and fats, broken down and digested very quickly. Carbohydrates are the main source of energy for your brain and your central nervous system. So that's what the body needs. That's what the body prefers, is to have that good source of glucose, you know, so that you can get up and have your breakfast, you can go on your errands, you can go for your walk, you can do all of those things that you need to do throughout the day. And the body really prefers to have that good source of glucose. So carbohydrate servings, you know, there's been a lot in terms of diets and nutrition about low carb diets. I'm sure you've seen that ketogenic diet or South Beach or all these things that kind of come through over the years. Carbohydrates, as I said, are really important because they're that source of glucose. But I think it's, you know, accurate to say that most of us eat too many of them. And that's where we sometimes can kind of think about our portions or servings for those. So here on the screen, we've got some examples of what is a carbohydrate serving. For a small potato, about the size of a computer mouse, if you want to think about it in terms of a visual, that would be one serving. Generally, a slice of sandwich bread is going to be a serving. Half a cup of your starchy carbohydrates, which is things like corn, beans, peas, that would be one serving. For fruit is small in general in terms of carbohydrates, so about the size of a tennis ball for an apple or a peach, an orange, you know, a round type of fruit. Half of a medium-sized banana, about 2 tablespoons of dried fruit. So think raisins, dried cranberries, dried blueberries. Those are all one serving. And then finally, for our dairy products, those are also carbohydrates because they contain lactose. So things like cow's milk is going to be a carbohydrate containing food. So 8 ounces or 1 cup of that. 1 cup of plain unflavored yogurt is going to also be a serving. And if you think visually, which I think a lot of us do, sometimes it's hard to think, okay, well, what does half a cup look like? 2 tablespoons? I'm not really sure about that. But we can sometimes compare it to everyday objects. So here we've got that half a cup of pasta, about the size of a baseball there. Here's a pancake or a waffle, the size of a CD. If anyone remembers CDs, that's an accurate size there. So if you kind of think about, you know, one serving of a pancake could mean many different things. I'm picturing in my mind a pancake you might get at IHOP or Cracker Barrel or someplace like that. It's probably much, much larger than that little CD we see in the screen. Size of a sandwich bread there, also similar to a CD or DVD. And there's our 2 small cookies, one serving there. So we've got a couple of Oreos or perhaps Chips Ahoy is going to be a serving of something sweet like cookies. Pizza, same, can vary. I think about the Italian store, if anyone likes to go there, and that's definitely larger than $2 bills placed on top of each other. But that's what we're thinking about in terms of pizza. We're thinking about a little smaller slice. Lasagna, about 3 square inches there, about the size of a softball there for your pasta dish. So 2 types of carbohydrates are simple carbohydrates, quick energy sources. So that's going to be things that really break down very quickly in the body. Any type of sweets or desserts made with some type of enriched flour. So we've got a piece of cake there, candy such as jelly beans or gummy bears. Soda is going to be a simple carbohydrate, typically coming from some type of refined or white sugar, corn syrup, dextrose. Those are going to be something that breaks down very quickly, those kind of short chains of sugar molecules. The downside of simple carbohydrates is while they do provide a lot of energy very quickly, they do not generally give us a lot of important nutrients. They don't give us a lot of vitamins and minerals, and they do not give us fiber, which is something we really want to think about when we're making those carbohydrate selections in our diet. Complex carbohydrates, on the other hand, are coming from those higher fiber foods. So you think your whole grains, such as whole wheat, multi-grain bread, all of your fruits. Fruits are a carbohydrate, and they do have fructose or fruit sugar, but going to provide lots of good fiber and many vitamins and minerals. Vegetables are a carbohydrate, but very low in terms of grams of carbohydrates. So, such a large amount of vegetables out there, those are going to be a good complex carbohydrate. And then finally, our beans and legumes. That could be any kind of bean, whether it's black beans, navy beans, pinto beans, lentils, and then other legumes such as soybeans are going to be some of those complex carbohydrates. This is where carbohydrates are a very beneficial food. Not only providing us with that good source of energy from the glucose, also providing us with fiber. Fiber is beneficial, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the presentation. But fiber is going to provide us with, again, glucose over time. It's also going to help keep us full after meals. And in terms of the types of fiber, it's very beneficial for cholesterol. It can help with lowering our cholesterol. So I hate when I see things out there about, oh, well, carbs are bad and we should cut those out of our diet. And, people are trying to just avoid them. It's really more about the types of carbohydrates that you're choosing. And complex carbohydrates provide so many important benefits. It's not something that we want to just get rid of in our diet. So a few more examples of a carbohydrate serving. Again, if you're a visual person like I am, it's always good to kind of see what that looks like. So a slice of bread, as we saw earlier, half of an English muffin. A mini bagel is a carbohydrate serving. If you think about more of your bagels from a bagel store, a kind of place like Einstein's or even Panera, that's not just going to be one bagel. That's probably going to be multiple carbohydrate servings for something that large. But this little mini bagel would be just one serving. And then we've got some hot and cold cereals there, popcorn, a tortilla, a few other examples there. In terms of choosing those complex carbs, always thinking about trying to choose whole grains. So that might be things like your sandwich bread, your bagels, tortillas, even crackers, trying to choose something that's going to be a higher grain selection there with any of the crackers or cereals. The way we know if a food is a whole grain is by looking at the ingredients list. If you see in that picture on the screen, our first ingredient is whole wheat flour. So that lets us know that this is a whole grain. If the first ingredient says something like enriched flour, we would know that it's not a whole grain. So it's not providing that important fiber in our diet. So we always want to look for that. You can also sometimes see things on the label from the Whole Grains Council. It's a little symbol that will show that this product has whole grains, perhaps 100%, perhaps 50%. It can kind of vary from product to product, but that it does have some whole grains in there. A few other examples of the difference between whole grains and refined grains. Whole is really the key word when we're looking at that ingredients list. So we're looking for whole wheat, we're looking for whole grain corn, we're looking for things that are going to provide, that full kernel of grains, giving us both the bran, the endosperm, all those good parts of it, and the extra fiber there. Some refined grains, when you're looking at that label, particularly for things like cereal, you might see something like oat flour. We would want to see whole oat flour in that case, or whole oats instead of that missing word there, the missing word of whole. I wanted to point out here on the rice, it gives the example of brown rice and colored rice, such as black rice, and those would be examples of whole grains. It is something where you can find brown basmati rice, brown jasmine rice. So I don't think we see, just white rice as much as we used to with those foods. Obviously, white rice is going to be more of a refined grain, but sometimes you can still find, the brown basmati rice that is a whole grain. And then in terms of flours, trying to choose that whole wheat or whole grain flours instead of the white flour or the enriched flours. So talking a little bit about another source of carbohydrates, which is added sugars. Added sugars are sweeteners the manufacturer has added to a product. So we see those often in things like sodas. That would be your regular sodas, such as Coca-Cola, Sprite, Pepsi, yogurts, candies, or cereals. They come under a number of different names. Sometimes it'll just say sugar or cane sugar, sometimes dextrose, sometimes honey, sometimes high fructose corn syrup, lots of different names for added sugars. We have what we call natural sugars, and natural sugars are sugars that are found in things like fruit and milk. Those are not added sugars. Those are still providing us with many nutrients, of course, fiber, and also providing us with vitamins and minerals, whereas added sugars typically are not providing us with anything other than additional calories or energy there. The dietary guidelines recommend that we limit our added sugars to less than 10% of our total daily calories. So just to give you an example of what that would look like, if I was a person on about a 1,400 calorie diet per day, that would come out to be about 140 calories or 35 grams of added sugar. We can convert the grams to teaspoons, and I know that gets a little complicated because we think about sugar and sweeteners oftentimes in terms of teaspoons or tablespoons, but we can convert that to grams by noting that 4 grams of added sugar is equal to 1 teaspoon. So that 35 grams would be equal to 9 teaspoons. So again, just to give you kind of a reference for that, a can of Coke, of Coca-Cola, 12 ounces, has 39 grams or about 10 teaspoons of added sugars. So if I was that person on the 1,400 calorie diet, you know, I would be almost, or I would be actually over my limit with that 1 can of Coca-Cola in terms of added sugars there. And the reason,
comment here, Lisa, somebody's saying that they've also noticed that a lot of things like condiments and pasta sauces have both added sugar and high fructose corn syrup added to them. So, you know, that shows up everywhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we'll look at a couple examples here in just a minute. But there's definitely some places we would expect. I don't think any of us on the call today is surprised that a Coca-Cola has added sugar in it. But there's definitely other areas that you wouldn't expect it at all. You know, it's very surprising to see that this has sugar added to it. And sometimes I look at things and I say, why? Why is there sugar in this? I don't understand why this has to be added there. The average American gets about 270 calories of added sugars each day, or about 17 teaspoons. So most of us, you know, unfortunately go beyond that 10% of our total daily calories. And to the point, it's because it's in so many foods. It's just been added quite frequently there. So let's look at it.
That they're looking at nutrition labels on cereals. They've said just plain old Cheerios seem like a really good choice because they don't have a lot of added sugar or anything else.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is definitely something we want to look for. If we think about, you know, some of the places where it's maybe not as obvious to us, breakfast cereals might be a case where we don't recognize that would be something if we're not choosing, you know, kids cereals, if we're not choosing Frosted Flakes or Honey Crisp or something like that, we might not think this product would have added sugars and maybe it doesn't taste sweet to us. But that is actually a very common place to have added sugars. I do like Cheerios. I think Cheerios is a good choice for breakfast cereals. When I'm thinking about a breakfast cereal, I'm thinking about, okay, well, yes, added sugars. Let's see if there's some sweeteners in there that we want to really minimize. The second thing I'm thinking about is fiber. And one thing that can be a downside of some of these breakfast cereals is they're very low in added sugar. So I'm thinking of something like Rice Krispies, not a lot of added sugars in there, but it's very low in fiber. It doesn't provide much fiber. Whereas something like Cheerios does give us some good fiber. And in particular, it gives us some soluble fiber from the oats, which can be beneficial for our cholesterol. So absolutely, I recommend with a breakfast cereal to try to keep the added sugars as low as possible. I mean, really below 8 grams would be kind of, you know, your ceiling there, but really even less if you can find that. And then trying to keep the fiber closer to about 5 grams per serving. So we're getting some of those really, you know, good benefits there.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions. One is, how bad is it to drink Diet Cola or other diet drinks?
Yeah, so diet soda, such as Diet Coke, Coke Zero, those are not going to have added sugars in there. They're using what's called a sugar substitute, or sometimes artificial sweetener. You can kind of think of something like stevia, Splenda. Those are more the brand names, but it's something that's going to be a sugar substitute. As a dietitian, I counsel moderation, and I know that's very cliche to say so, but I think it's okay to have an occasional Diet Coke. I think it is preferable generally to a regular Coke because it's not going to have that added sugar. And by moderation, I would say, maybe 1 or 2 a week. I don't recommend having lots of them. And my reason for that is they're displacing healthier beverage choices. So they're displacing water, they're displacing milk, they're displacing things that are going to provide us with some more benefits. Whereas a Diet Coke might just give us enjoyment, would be the one thing there. So here and there, I think it's fine. Just wouldn't do multiple ones a day.
Okay, is natural honey good as a sugar substitute?
So technically honey would still be considered an added sugar. It's going to be something that, you're adding to a product, whether you're putting it in your afternoon tea or whether it's something that's been added to, a granola bar, it is still going to be an added sugar. We can make the argument that honey perhaps provides a few more benefits. It does have some antioxidant properties. It does provide a little bit of minerals. So probably a little bit better than a white sugar or a refined sugar, but we still want to think about it in terms of small amounts, that we really want to minimize those added sugars in our diet because it's going to provide extra calories and it's also possibly going to provide something that's just not going to give us as many benefits as another food.
And finally, this person says they heard last year that the FDA was going to be eliminating high fructose corn syrup from foods by a certain date. Are you aware of that?
I have not heard that. So I'm not sure on that one. That's not anything that I've heard. I know it certainly, was demonized quite a bit. And so it's something a lot of people avoid. I've seen it as a marketing term on different products, like no high fructose corn syrup. I think what we find a lot of times is there's still some sort of other sweetener being used instead of high fructose corn syrup. So the bottom line is looking at that added sugars on the label. But no, I have not heard that specifically.
Okay.
All right, well, I'll move on then with the slides. Again, some easier places to spot added sugar, things we think of like sodas or, kids cereals, candies, chocolates. And then harder ones could be those breakfast cereals, which she talks about, instant oatmeal, granola bars, even some of those foods that someone noted, like the condiments, barbecue sauce, ketchup, canned soup. I saw a can of tomato soup and they had added sugar in it. So again, just don't necessarily think about that, but it is very common to add to different products here. So we always want to look at that label and just kind of scan it for those added sugars. Here's a couple products where we can see what has been added. This first one is a trail mix granola bar, and the ones that are in bold are added sugars. So we've got our high maltose corn syrup, we've got honey, we've got sugar, we've got fructose, we've got maltodextrin, we've got malt extract. Those are all added sugars, and it comes up to about 6 grams of added sugar per bar. Honey bunches of oats with almonds. We've got sugar, brown sugar, corn syrup, malted corn and barley syrup, honey. And that adds up to about 8 grams of added sugar per serving, of course. When we look at a nutrition facts label, we always want to make sure we're looking at that serving size, because with breakfast cereal, many of us tend to eat more than 1 serving. Oftentimes the serving might be 3/4 of a cup or 1 cup. And if we're having, something like 2 cups, it's going to be more than 8 grams of sugar, because we might be having 1.5 to 2 servings of that. Just touching a little bit on fruit juice. Now, fruit is a natural sugar. So when we think about something like an apple that is a natural sugar, we can make the argument that the juice from an apple, like apple juice or orange juice, is more of a natural sugar, but it still is going to be adding sugar to our diet, even though it is more of a natural sugar. Juice is not going to give us the fiber that an actual orange would. So it's going to be something that your body is going to convert to glucose very quickly, tends to spike the blood sugar. With my patients who have diabetes and are taking insulin, we do want to monitor their blood sugar for low blood sugars, for hypoglycemia. So sometimes we'll say, oh, we'll keep a little orange juice in the fridge, just in case you have a low, you want to treat that with some juice. And the reason for that is because the blood sugar is going to go up very, very quickly with that juice. Now, when we don't have a diabetes, or when we just are trying to keep our blood sugar in a nice steady range, we don't want that juice to be spiking our blood sugar. So we can see how the grams of total sugar can be, really high for juice when we're having larger sizes of that. These are all based on 1 cup or 8 ounces. So something that, I really encourage my patients to try to choose the whole fruit and minimize the juice in the diet, because it's going to provide more benefits with that whole fruit in terms of fiber. So here's just an example of a day and how that added sugar can add up very quickly. For breakfast, we've got 1 packet of your Quaker cinnamon and spice oatmeal. So this is one of the flavored oatmeals, 10 grams of added sugar. We're having a mixed berry yogurt, 12 grams of added sugar, the tomato soup and grilled cheese, 10 grams of added sugar, generally coming from probably the bread and from the soup. And then a Cliff granola bar, 20 grams of added sugar. And then finally using a jarred spaghetti sauce for our spaghetti and meatballs, 4 grams of added sugar there. So we've got about 56 grams in total. The American Heart Association recommends somewhere between 25 and 36 grams of added sugar per day or less for men and women. So this person has really kind of gone above that, whether they're male or female. So you can see how it really adds up, and you might kind of think, oh, well, that seems like a pretty healthy diet. They're having oatmeal, they're having yogurt, they're having, soup. And it just, comes from a lot of these more processed and packaged foods where we're seeing that added sugar in the diet. So one way to minimize that is to try to do more, of our own foods, trying to keep things as simple as possible. So instead, we're having, some plain oatmeal. We're adding some fruit to it, and again, that's going to be, the whole fruit, which has the natural sugar. Adding some chopped pecans, a little pinch of cinnamon, which I think is a nice way to add flavor without sugar. We're having a plain yogurt, adding some mixed berries to that. So all of these do not have added sugar. There are going to be some natural sugar in there from the fruit and the berries, but we're not going to have any added sugar. We're making our own tomato soup, so of course can control the amount of sweeteners added to it. We're making our own granola, which may have a little bit of added sugar. Maybe I'm adding a little bit of honey to that, but it's minimal, and it's probably going to be far less than what you're going to find in the store-bought brand. And then we're also making our spaghetti and meatballs again, but we're using a product, in this case, Newman's Own, that has no added sugar. So you can certainly still find jarred foods and packaged foods that have less added sugar. So here we've made a really big improvement, only 5 grams of added sugar for very similar foods there. So my point being, we do better, preparing our own foods, making things at home versus buying those packaged foods in the grocery store, which may have added sugar and oftentimes sodium as well. All right. Well, if there are no more questions on carbohydrates, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end, if anything else comes up, I'll move on to protein.
We actually do.
Okay.
Wanted to ask, what are the diseases or health problems that too much sugar in your diet can cause?
Yeah. So diets that are very high in refined sugars can really increase the chances for diseases such as diabetes. Cardiovascular disease would be another one. Kidney disease would be another one. What is happening in terms of the increased risk for those chronic diseases is the inflammation in the body that's caused by those higher amounts of added sugar and processed foods, which really increases our risk for some of those chronic diseases that are much closer tied to diet than some other ones, even some cancers in terms of breast cancer and colon and rectal cancer, increased risk with having more of those processed high sugar foods in the diet.
Another question is, how much does exercise impact your daily food intake?
Yeah, so, we've got our basic kind of equilibrium between energy in and energy out. So, if we're burning more calories than we're taking in, that certainly can help with weight maintenance. I think I like to use the phrase, you can't outrun your diet, meaning that if we have a very poor diet, but, maybe I'm a very active person, that's probably better than being sedentary, but it's still going to have an impact. So they kind of go hand in hand, and that we want to make good choices in terms of food, as well as being physically active. And what many people find is the better their diet, the better they do in terms of activity. You know, they have more energy, they are able to, you know, walk longer, or, you know, play pickleball longer, or whatever their, you know, type of activity they like to do. So it's still going to, you know, go very closely together. In terms of weight loss, if someone is working toward weight loss, we do focus mostly on the diet and nutrition. That's going to have the biggest impact. But when we get to things like weight maintenance, I don't want to put back on the weight that I've lost, then physical activity really becomes much more important. And that's really key for keeping that weight off.
Okay, no more questions. There was one comment about one additional problem with carbonated beverages is that they're really hard on your tooth enamel.
Oh yeah, particularly for the sweetened ones, for sure. Yeah, definitely going to increase risk of dental caries with those too. Yeah, absolutely.
And a number of people commenting on how much added sugar there is in all kinds of things, like vegan cuisine entrees.
Oh yeah, I know. Once you start looking for it, it's everywhere. It really is.
Okay, we have a new question. Are there any foods, vitamins, or minerals that can help alleviate extremely dry, flaky, or crepey skin?
In terms of dry skin, one of the biggest impacts is going to be fats, and we'll talk about that in just a bit here, but that is going to provide more of that kind of insulation and more of that lubrication for skin. You know, in terms of aging, you know, certainly, you know, having a healthy diet and having diets that are lower in processed food, you know, is generally going to be good. Adequate fluid is going to be something that's beneficial there. But in terms of dry skin in particular, you know, we certainly want to be mindful about our fat intake. And we'll talk about the types of fat we want to choose in just a bit.
Okay.
All right, well then changing gears to talk about our next macronutrient, your protein. Protein is important in the body because it helps with building and repairing muscles, skin cells, different body cells. We find protein primarily in meats and dairy, although we do have plant-based proteins, which will be things like beans, nuts and seeds, soy foods. We want to try to choose lean proteins in our diet. Lean proteins are going to be poultry, such as chicken and turkey, white fish, such as tilapia, flounder, mahi-mahi, lots of choices there, beans, and then legumes, such as your soybeans and lentils. So talking a little more specifically about protein servings, 7 grams of protein is equal to 1 ounce serving. So here's some 1 ounce servings that would be meat, such as beef, fish, poultry, such as chicken, an ounce of cheese, and we'll look at some visuals in just a minute to kind of see what that would look like, a whole egg, a 1/4 cup of cottage cheese, nut butter, such as peanut butter or almond butter, and then about a 1/2 cup of tofu or tempeh. Those are your soy-based proteins. As we mentioned earlier, you know, it's really going to vary how much protein you need throughout the day, but on average, about 3 to 4 servings of protein at each meal is appropriate for most people. So that doesn't mean we have to have only 1 ounce of chicken at a meal. If we were trying to get closer to 3 to 4 ounces of protein, it might be 4 ounces of chicken if that was our main protein source at our meal. So looking at some of these protein equivalents, that's the way the dietary guidelines defines them. We've got about a 1/2 ounce of nuts, so that would be 12 almonds if you were counting them, 1 ounce of cooked salmon, a tablespoon of peanut butter, 1/2 cup of beans, tofu, eggs. There's some different examples there. In terms of those proteins, excuse me, of protein servings, what I find in my practice is that people do very well at protein at dinner. That's where we have our, maybe our steak, or we have our big piece of salmon. Where people tend to forget protein, I find, is at breakfast. That's an area other than eggs, sometimes we don't think about including protein. And we really want to balance our protein throughout the day. So trying to get, somewhere between that 3 to 4 ounces at breakfast, at lunch, and at dinner as well. So always thinking about, well, what is a way I can add a little more protein? If I like to have oatmeal, for example, maybe I want to add some nuts to that. Maybe I want to add some seeds like the chia seeds or the flax seeds. Maybe I want to have a boiled egg on the side. That's a way to add more protein and really balance that throughout the day.
Lisa, what's the downside of having too much protein in your diet?
So too much protein can be hard on the kidneys. Someone that has a very high protein diet can sometimes kind of stress their kidneys. That one of the functions of the kidneys is to filter out some of the byproducts that we get from protein foods. So that can be one negative about it. The other thing to remember is protein has calories. Protein does not just turn into muscle, no matter what the bodybuilding sites will tell you. If we have too much protein in our diet, our body will use what it needs, and then it's going to convert any excess into fat. So it will just be stored as body fat. So that would be another negative about having too much protein in your diet. In terms of choices, again, those lean proteins, so that's going to be your poultry, your fish. We can also make good choices with beef. We can choose ground beef that it's 90% or higher of lean. There, we can also choose things like bison, which is naturally, going to be a leaner beef. We can choose things like sirloin. Anything that ends in loin, and that's L-O-I-N, is going to be a leaner cut of meat. So sirloin, pork tenderloin, those are going to be kind of leaner choices as opposed to something like a T-bone steak or lamb that tends to be a fattier meat and much higher in calories. The guidelines are to choose seafood twice per week. So that could be, something like salmon, that could be shrimp, that could be tilapia, lots of choices there. We want to try to trim some of that saturated fat from our meat. So that would be removing the skin from poultry, kind of trimming some of that fat around perhaps a pork chop, trying just to reduce some of that saturated fat, which is going to contribute some extra calories, but it's also going to contribute some types of fat that we really want to minimize in our diet. And then working toward more plant-based protein choices. A popular thing is meatless Mondays. So having something that has beans, tofu, vegetables, and reducing some of those more animal-based proteins. That's going to be a way to give you some more fiber in your diet because we're going to find those fiber from the plant-based foods. And then it's also going to reduce the saturated fat in the diet as well.
Lisa, we're about 10 minutes to 11, just so you know.
Yeah, try to keep an eye on that. So I will definitely keep cruising along here. All right, so our fats, that's our last macronutrient. And again, that's including the carbohydrates, protein, and now fats. In terms of functions, dietary fats give our body energy, support the cell functions. It provides insulation, basically helps keep us warm. It's going to help with absorbing your fat-soluble vitamins. So vitamin D would be an example of a fat-soluble vitamin, and that's one that many of us tend to be deficient in or a little low. So we want to have some good, healthy fats in our diet. And it also can help with regulating our cholesterol numbers. We want to think about the types of fat we're choosing. I think probably all of us lived through the 1980s when, fat was the enemy. And if you were trying to eat healthfully and trying to possibly lose weight, you'd want to stay away from fat, it's all the SnackWell cookies and those types of things. We know now that it's really the types of fat you're choosing that's more important than just a low fat diet. So we're going to talk about which ones are better for our heart, which ones are better for our diet. Saturated fats are typically recommended to be limited in the diet. Those are going to come from your animal-based proteins, so beef, lamb, pork chops, veal. Going to have a lot of saturated fats in your processed meats, so bacon, salami, sausage, hot dogs. We're also going to find them in tropical oils, such as coconut oil and palm oil. We find them in butter. We find them in full-fat dairy, such as whole milk or cream. The reason that it's recommended we limit saturated fats in our diet is they tend to raise your LDL or your bad cholesterol. Your bad cholesterol is the one we want to kind of keep on the lower end, typically below 100 milligrams per deciliter on your lab work. So it's not that we can never have bacon, of course. It's just that we don't want to have it. I always like to use the 80-20 rule. So that means, 80% of the time we're trying to make those good, healthy choices. 20% we might have a little indulgence, such as bacon. And trying to use as our cooking oil more oils and not things like the butter or the tropical oils. Trans fats is something we're not seeing as much of anymore. This was actually kind of legislated out of our food supply. So it's not something that manufacturers are able to put into products as much as we used to see. Trans fats are coming from foods that have partially hydrogenated oils. So we used to see it always in cookies and crackers. If you looked at the label, you'd always see partially hydrogenated oils, and typically there would be trans fats from those. It was, as I said, legislated to remove that from the food supply. So we don't see it as much on some of those packaged foods, but it's still around. Some of the most common places is your commercial baked goods, such as muffins, scones, croissants, your stick margarines, yogurt covered pretzels or raisins, refrigerated pie crust, non-dairy coffee creamers. These are recommended to be avoided. So we said, with saturated fats, generally limiting them, but, certainly can have a little bacon or hot dog occasionally. Trans fats provide no benefits whatsoever in the diet. They raise our bad cholesterol or LDL while decreasing our good cholesterol or HDL. So they're not providing any good benefits. So we really want to stay away from them. The last time I saw trans fats was I was working at a high school football game in the little snack bar there. And since I'm a dietitian, of course, I had to look at the label. I had a big vat of that nacho cheese, and I glanced at that, and there were trans fats in it. So I'm not quite sure if this cheese had been there for so long that it was before it was kind of taken out of the food supply, or if perhaps this was a smaller manufacturer and was kind of exempt from that. I'm not really sure, but it did actually have trans fats in it. So that was a little surprising to me because I don't see it very often anymore, but certainly still something we want to avoid. And then finally, our healthy fats, your monounsaturated fats, which is going to be things like olive oil, canola oil, peanut, sunflower oil, avocados, nuts and nut butters, seeds such as pumpkin seeds or sunflower seeds, olives. This is a recommended fat, provides many benefits in terms of cholesterol, tends to lower our LDL or bad cholesterol in the diet. So this is something when we're choosing a fat, we want to choose most frequently, using olive oil or canola oil for your cooking, choosing nuts and seeds for your snacks. Those are all going to be healthy choices. Your polyunsaturated fats are also beneficial fats. That's also going to be some oils such as sunflower, corn oil, seeds such as sesame seeds, pumpkin seeds, chia and flax seeds. Walnuts are the only polyunsaturated fat out of the nuts and pine nuts that we're going to get some of those good omega-3 fatty acids. Those are a type of polyunsaturated fat that you're going to find in things like the walnuts, the flax seeds, as well as your fatty fish such as salmon, trout, herring, sardines. This is also a recommended type of fat. It tends to lower the bad cholesterol or the LDL. So when you're choosing that seafood twice a week, I think it's a good idea to try to make one of them the fattier fish, such as the salmon or the trout. And again, adding some of those things like the chia seeds or the flax seeds, perhaps to your yogurt or your oatmeal to make some good fat choices in your diet. Couple examples here of some of the servings. This is comparing it to a teaspoon of oil, which is often what we think about in terms of a fat. So half of an avocado, 4 olives, about an ounce of sunflower seeds, a tablespoon of peanut butter. And we saw that peanut butter in the protein, but we also consider that to be a fat as well, providing both protein and fat, which is common for many foods, not always going to be just a carbohydrate or a protein or a fat. It's going to have some overlap in that area. All right, and then this is just another visual for you. I often use this, when people kind of get a little fatigue of, looking at labels and counting calories and all that sort of thing. So just kind of thinking of the plate in different parts. So making most of our plate those non-starchy vegetables. Here we've got some broccolini. And then on the other side, we've got about a quarter of our plate, the carbohydrates, so some brown rice, and a quarter of our plate, a lean protein. So we've got some salmon here. So it's just a way to kind of think about your plate when you're, maybe perhaps feeling like, oh, I don't want to be weighing my food. I don't want to be measuring everything. I really want to make good choices, always starting with those vegetables and really trying to fill up with those. So another example of what that might look like here, we've got salad, we've got some sliced turkey, and we've got some sweet potato, some mashed sweet potato there to build that healthy plate. So with our healthy choices, again, choosing those lean proteins, the low-fat dairy, I generally recommend 1% or skim milk, low-fat yogurt, whole grain breads, rice and pastas, and then really trying to do more of those plant-based proteins. If you're new to that, might be starting with something like 1 day a week and then building on it from there. These are some areas where you can kind of go from some of those higher calorie snacks, such as the tortilla chips, maybe choosing some vegetables like the baby carrots. We can minimize those added sugars by choosing fresh fruit instead of the fruit products from the grocery store, choosing more of the whole grains, things like nuts and seeds instead of cookies, and using the oils instead of the butter in cooking and in adding to your other foods there. And then just touching on a nutrition facts label, some things we always want to look for: the serving size. That's going to be found right here at the top. So about 1 cup is our serving size. That's important to know because everything below that is based on that 1 serving size. So if you think back to that example we had of the cereal, if I'm having 2 cups of cereal, of course, I'm going to have to double the calories, double the carbohydrates, double the added sugar in that case. So we always want to make sure we're looking at accurate serving sizes. Things we want to limit is going to be our saturated fat, our sodiums, and added sugars. And an easy rule of thumb for that is just to think about this percentage daily value. So we consider 5% to be low, 20% to be high. So things that we're trying to limit, such as the saturated fat, we want to keep that closer to 5%. Whereas things we're trying to increase, such as our fiber or perhaps our vitamins and minerals, we want to keep those closer to 25%. So if we look at this example, this product is pretty high in saturated fat, right? And it's got 23% of that daily value from saturated fat. We want to keep that closer to 5%. On the flip side, this is a good source of calcium, 25% calcium there. So that's an easy kind of rule of thumb. That daily value isn't accurate for everyone because it's based on a 2,000 calorie daily diet, and we're all kind of different in that area. But we can still kind of use that 5% is low, 20% is high, just to kind of make a quick judgment as to whether this is a product I want to, put in my grocery cart or not. And then just wrapping up with sodium, the recommendations for sodium is 2,300 milligrams per day for the population. The American Heart Association recommends less for certain populations. So people who have been diagnosed with hypertension or high blood pressure, diabetes or chronic kidney disease, or over the age of 51. That's really hard to do, I'll be honest with you, to keep that to 1,500 milligrams or less. Most of our dietary sodium comes from processed foods and restaurant foods. So those are going to be things like your breads, your pizzas, sandwiches and cold cuts, canned soups, burritos, tacos. If you have any time on your hand, go look at the nutrition information for things like Chipotle or Panera, and you'll be really shocked at how much sodium is in some of those foods, even the ones we think about as pretty healthy, like Sweetgreen. The salad places even tend to have a lot of sodium from the dressings. So just like we talked about with the added sugars, trying to do more of your foods at home, such as making your own salad dressings or making your own even salsa is really a way to reduce some of the sodium in your diet. And these are just a few more examples of some of those high sodium foods. I think many of them probably aren't surprising. I think we all know that bacon and hot dogs tend to be high in sodium, potato chips, but we can even find them in some of those, condiments. We can find them in things like cheese, which we don't always think about in terms of sodium. Even some of those seasoning mixes. You think about some of those rubs you might put on a chicken breast or something, can have a lot of added salt. So always taking a look at the label for that. So we kind of talked about this already, just, reducing, some of those processed foods is a really good way to reduce sodium. Rinsing canned foods such as beans or even things like green beans is going to reduce the sodium by about 1/3, and using those herbs and spices to flavor your food instead of salt. All right, last slide here, just on dietary fiber. So for women, 25 grams per day or more. For men, 38 grams. We're going to get dietary fiber from your plant foods. So trying to choose, things like oatmeal for breakfast, adding fruit and nuts, choosing the whole wheat bread, trying to increase our vegetables, including those whole grains such as quinoa or brown rice. And of course, the steamed broccoli and the vegetables is going to be another way to increase that dietary fiber there. So I will stop sharing and just see if there are any last questions that I can answer. Oh, yes, that is a really good one. I left that out. Let me bring that up one more time. I'm sorry. That is a really good question. All right. Okay, there's my contact information. I apologize for that. We are on the main Virginia Hospital Center campus. We see patients here in the outpatient clinic. So that is our website. It will tell you a little bit more about some of the services we offer here. We offer both diabetes self-management. We also have classes for pre-diabetes with the diabetes prevention program. And then we also see patients for what's called medical nutrition therapy. So that could be things like weight loss, high cholesterol, kidney disease, IBS, lots of things that nutrition is having an impact on someone's health. So that is our phone number and email address. So happy to answer any questions that you have if you need to get some more information, or if you want to schedule an appointment with one of the dietitians here.
Well, Lisa, this is fabulous. I think, Gary, you might be muted. Do you know that? We did have more questions. I think you should stop recording, Gary, and this is going to be on.